let's get to our fourth panel of the day, which is about ensuring diversity in the Canadian recovery. And this panel is moderated by the Canadian Chamber's own Rose Catacall, Diversity and Inclusion Advisor. Rose, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Catherine. Delighted to be here. And as you mentioned, we are going to be talking about ensuring diversity in the Canadian recovery. It's an interesting topic, given what I've heard throughout the day. Everyone's actually been talking about this in some shape or form, so I'm delighted that this is near the end of the day. Let me introduce our panelists first. I will start with Angelita Graham. She's a partner at Mercer. She leads 500 colleagues in the Toronto office. She has led the Women at Mercer Business Resource Group in Toronto for 5 years. Angelita has a BSc from the University of the West Indies, a diploma in actuarial science from City University, and an MBA from the University of Leicester in the UK. She is a fellow of both the Canadian Institute of Actuaries and the Society of Actuaries. Next, we have Jennifer Cook. She is the Director of Inclusive Trade at Export Development Canada, a graduate of the Richard Ivey School of Business at the University of Western Ontario. She works with Canadian companies to help them succeed in international markets. She is focused on helping more women and diverse entrepreneurs export to grow their business. EDC offers specialized trade knowledge, facilitates trade with financing and insurance, and provides connections to enable companies to go, grow, and succeed globally. Then we have Max Bro. He is the Vice President, BDO Management Consulting. He identifies accessibility issues for corporations, governments, and non-governmental agencies and provides strategic solutions. Previously, Max guided the Government of Canada's historic legislation for persons with disabilities, the Accessible Act, the Canada Act. He is executive producer of The Race to the Starting Line, a documentary, a story about this same act. Max holds a BA in political science from the Carleton University. And last but not least, we have Sheila North. She is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Legacy Bows. She is a member of the Bunny Boney Bee Cree Nation and was elected as Grand Chief of Manitoba Kiwati-Nowi Okimake Kanak in September 2015. Previously, she was a Chief Communication Officer at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, a CBC journalist, a CTV correspondent, and an Economic Development Officer. Sheila holds a diploma in business accounting, rural development, a certificate in broadcasting, and a diploma in communications. She is the author of My Privilege, My Responsibility. So thank you again to our esteemed panelists. So I'd like to start with the first question to Jennifer. What opportunities will shape the road to recovery for unrepresented and underrepresented groups?
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much to the Chamber for this opportunity to be with you today and to speak on this panel. So thank you, Rose, for that question. You know, there's no doubt that the pandemic has had tremendous negative impacts on businesses across Canada and has certainly disproportionately impacted women and diverse entrepreneurs. In particular, because they're highly engaged in industries such as services and those like the arts, entertainment and recreation, food and accommodation, transportation and warehousing, and other services. So while the pandemic and therefore the global economic outlook continue to evolve, opportunities and challenges for Canadian businesses are shifting as well. Some insights from EDC's economics team show that companies continue to report a negative impact on sales, both domestically and export sales. Of course, having to worry about employee safety has put additional burden on business owners. And with cross-border and travel restrictions continuing, there have been supply chain disruptions, also challenges in connecting with customers, supply shortages, and transportation challenges that they all have to navigate. That said, although there's been and continues negative impact on sales across the board due to the pandemic, we're also seeing some companies expanding their operations, and many are pivoting and finding new domestic and international opportunities. So opportunities do exist, and they will help shape the road to recovery for diverse-owned businesses if they can capitalize on them. Um, so from our surveys, we're seeing more companies finding new domestic and international opportunities from the current economic situation around COVID-19. The pandemic continues on, and there's continued adaptation to the new business as unusual, as we're calling it at EDC. Um, and so companies are actually pivoting to support the pandemic, which can provide opportunities. We see that financing needs are less urgent now compared to the start of the pandemic. With unprecedented monetary and fiscal support from the Canadian government, it appears that that's been effective at helping companies with their financial challenges. And we find that more companies surveyed now can operate for more than a year before needing additional financing. And finally, we've seen a significant number of companies improve and adapt their online sales capabilities and adoption of technology. COVID-19 has had the effect of greatly accelerating the shift to online activities, and we found that Canadian companies have thus improved these online sales capabilities. Even though this is challenging, it's certainly critical. So, some of my own observations around the pandemic, it's offered an opportunity for entrepreneurs and business owners to reflect and work on their business rather than in the business, and reset strategies, find new opportunities domestically and internationally resulting from the pandemic to pivot or find new areas of business. Leveraging digital technologies to adapt and expand online sales capabilities for greater reach is imperative. And this applies to both goods and service providers. Digital trade really holds the promise for lower transaction costs and access to new markets, with really significant opportunities, I think, to empower women in diverse businesses. Adopting technology and digital capabilities opens up the world for a business. I heard someone say, and I keep repeating it, online is export. And so digital trade creates a flexibility and can be really advantageous for women who might be constrained by heavier share of family responsibilities or other unpaid work. There's, of course, still challenges and barriers for some in this regard, but it's a great opportunity for diverse businesses to advance. I'd say as well that there's really no better time to consider new markets as opportunities for business growth. Canada has a total of 15 free trade agreements, including CUSMA, the CPTPP, and CETA, with 49 countries, 36 foreign investment promotion and protection agreements, and many more negotiations in progress around the globe. And so it's never really been a better time to diversify your business if you're not already. This can add up to over 1.5 billion new potential customers outside our borders. And so really what we need here in Canada is for all ambitious Canadians to think globally. Free trade agreements have the potential to help Canada diversify its trade and open new markets. And we're talking about new modernized agreements that have chapters to really support SMEs and women-owned businesses through specific gender chapters to support services businesses as well. This is supplemented by Canada also signing on to the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, which is a commitment to advance an inclusive approach to trade and address the barriers that women face when participating in trade. And certainly at EDC, we're really being proactive with a dedicated strategy toward supporting more inclusive trade here in Canada. So I would say that there's also supplier diversity, which is gaining traction. This is very big in the US market and gaining momentum in Canada, Europe, and elsewhere. Consumers are really starting to procure more based on their values. Companies are carving out space for more women-owned businesses or diverse-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, and this can be game-changing in terms of access to markets. And once again, doesn't preclude services. It's not just for goods. It often requires certification, so it's important to make sure you have your paperwork right. But finally, to close out, really, governments are doing more than ever with fiscal and monetary policies to support businesses, and particularly those historically underserved businesses, to get past the economic downturn and thrive going forward. And policymakers are more than ever before focused on inclusion and are putting resources behind it. So I say that businesses really don't have to go it alone. There's a lot of resources out there to help them. And particularly focused on financial inclusion. So I think I'll leave it there for now, Rose.
Thank you. I learned a lot about our place in the global market, so thank you for sharing that. Angelita, do you have anything to add in terms of opportunities?
Okay, thanks, Rose. First, let me say thanks to the Chamber for allowing me to be here today to have this conversation. Really delighted to be here. I think what I would want to add to the conversation is that in addition to what Jennifer has already said, wanted to just maybe take a slightly different angle and add one more thing. And it's really around, if we're ensuring an inclusive recovery for all, talk about access to capital. We all know that access to funds is really critical for a business to grow and be sustainable. And I think their studies have shown that for businesses owned by minority groups and other underrepresented groups, access to capital is one of the largest impediments for them to scale and sustain their businesses. And as we think about the recovery and participation in that, there are two recent surveys that I saw, one commissioned by the African Canadian Senate Group, which looked at 342 Black entrepreneurs. And that showed that the biggest challenge that they face really is access to capital. A similar one was done recently again by the Black Chamber of Commerce of about 50 or so business owners. And the same issue was noted that the number one challenge that they face is really access to capital. So I think as we think about inclusive recovery and recovery, making it easier for these businesses to access funds or making more funds available to them would aid in an inclusive recovery. I know that the government has set aside $221 million last summer to make funds available to Black entrepreneurs via commercial bank. And I think for sure that's definitely a step in the right direction. And I know Jennifer has mentioned other institutions as well. So I think that's for sure a step in the right direction. I think to ensure success, though, I would go one step further. I think there's another dimension to that too. And it's really around ensuring that there is a broad awareness of these programs in the community. As sometimes the downfall is not that the funds are there, is the awareness of the funds, making sure that those in the community are aware of the funds. So like the Chamber of Commerce and other organizations can be very effective in bringing that news forward. So government agencies, not-for-profit organizations can really review their outreach programs and education campaigns to really increase awareness of these resources and make sure they're being ultimately accessible by the communities. And I also think that there is an opportunity for the banking institutions to kind of reassess their lending standards to make sure that there is no unintentional bias in the lending process, which would exclude these entrepreneurs from accessing funds. Because one of the challenges too, I think, is a lack of understanding of the lending institution of some of these underrepresented groups in terms of the products and services that they offer and cater to their community. And I think for progress to be made, institutions that finance businesses will need to think about bridging that knowledge gap. So I think that's one other thing that I would want to add to the conversation in terms of as we think about inclusive recovery, that we also have to zoom in on access to capital and making sure that everyone can participate and get back up and running in this economy.
Thank you, Angelita. I'll go to Sheila. Do you have anything to add in terms of opportunities?
Just that I think, thank you for having me, by the way, and thank you for hosting this very important topic, and of course to the Chamber. I would only add that I think that it's been more evident now that the pandemic has went through the entire world and in our worlds. I think that the social safety net needs to be built up even more, and I think from that creates a lot of opportunities, including capacity building and training people for new ways of doing things, and that includes, of course, in the healthcare system. The seniors, I think they became the most vulnerable. And why did that happen? I think that it showed that our priorities. So I think this is a good opportunity to start resetting some priorities, and that includes training more people to work and to supply what's needed for our seniors and vulnerable people. That includes also people that are dealing with mental health. I think that one of the things that came out that I saw was that people that were in mental health crisis, they had very little resources. And I know that there's long lineups to get into some of these centers to get help. So we definitely need more workers that are trained professionally, but also training trainers to get involved in building that social safety net even further. And there's a lot of good training opportunities, but also agencies out there that can do that work and start to rebuild an economy, and more importantly, strengthen that social safety net that our communities need so much, especially people that have been labeled now as the most vulnerable, and that's unfortunate.
Thank you, Sheila. And Max, anything to add in terms of opportunities? Max, you're on mute.
Yeah, of course, my mouse wasn't where it's supposed to be. Hi, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I want to go back to something that Angelita was saying, that, and I agree with her, is that one of the problems that we have is that there are some programs out there that are giving out some funds, but the problem is getting the knowledge out to the people who are looking at creating opportunities like new businesses, and making sure that they're aware of them. And at the same time, I fundamentally believe that, from my perspective, technology is a big key driving factor. And what I mean by that is, for persons with disabilities, one of the biggest obstacles that we've been having in the workplace is having access to being able to able to work from home, or to create business ventures from home. And as we all know, and I see all the heads shaking, that is one thing that's no longer an issue anymore. We now know that it's a proven track record that the majority of the Canadian population can function and work from home and still produce on an extraordinary high level. And so from that point of view is, how can we build on that, and how can we push that even further? And from another different perspective, this is also a golden opportunity for individuals who are thinking about, how do I create an opportunity that's not a brick and mortar opportunity, that how do I use all of this stuff we're now learned over COVID? I'm a big optimist. I love the opportunities that are presented during COVID, that we should explore them, and we haven't fully explored them to the best yet. And I'm really excited what the next decade is going to look like because of that.
Thank you, Max. Okay, we'll go to you, Angelita. From your experience, please share your insights into the primary barriers COVID has exacerbated for unrepresented and underrepresented groups.
Thanks, Rose. So I would say that, even before the pandemic, data showed us that we were already challenged in advancing the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda in the workplace and the broader economy. And according to insight from Mercer's 2021 Global Talent Trend Survey, most Canadian employers were focused on improving DEI. But really, when we look at it, only 30% actually had a multi-year plan in place to do so. And then here comes COVID, right? And what we have all seen is that COVID has disproportionately impacted the underrepresented group and unrepresented groups, and really exacerbated the challenges that we were already facing. So I guess from my perspective, the three challenges that I would want to kind of speak about that existed pre-pandemic that I believe have been intensified during the pandemic are: one, access to senior leadership and career progression, and including in that is mentorship and sponsorship. I think we all can agree that we know that to effectively showcase one's professional skills and talents, you must first be noticed. And also, most persons who have advanced or make it to the executive ranks have had help along the way, right? So, having an influential mentor or sponsor who can advocate on your behalf is key to upward mobility through the corporate ranks. And however, pre pandemic, anyway, studies showed us that in the workplace, women and BIPOC employees and other underrepresented groups really had low levels of sponsorship and also faced unconscious bias in the promotion process. So I think one of the challenges of remote working is that it has now diminished the informal networking opportunities with influential colleagues and access to leadership, which we know is key in one's career advancement. So, of course, concerns around access to leadership and mentorship during the pandemic would be heightened for this group relative to um, the other groups, as it really becomes even more difficult than before um, in this cycle of back to back Zoom calls to really get face time with senior leaders and build those relationships that, personal relationships with those in a company who would oversee promotions. So I think as we emerge from the pandemic and think about, onboarding in a virtual environment or a hybrid work environment, so too we will also need to be thoughtful and deliberate about creating those opportunities for informal networking and access for the underrepresented groups in a virtual or face-to-face environment. The other thing too, we will also have to really pay attention, I think, to what percentages of these employees are getting visibility, new job experiences, and stretched assignments if we continue to be in a virtual world. The second challenge that I want to point out, and I think all of us can attest to this, I think what has been exacerbated a lot for sure is the double shift burden for women. I mean, we know that in most households pre pandemic, women were already the primary caregivers and were dealing with challenges of balancing work and domestic responsibility. And so here comes a pandemic with daycares closed and school moving to online. Working moms now have seen an intensified burden around trying to balance all of these different roles. And research has shown that it has had an impact. This increased burden of double shifting that has arose during the pandemic has pushed many women to exit the workforce, and especially those from the BIPOC communities, some of whom may have depended on informal care provided by parents, relatives, friends, or they might have used in home daycare centers. And all of this has been kind of rolled back or been closed down. So here goes their support system, right? So the challenge has intensified for them. I saw some stats recently coming out of the US that says almost 1 million women have left the workforce during the pandemic because of this overwhelming burden. And for us here in Canada, stats can also show some stats that says 12 times more moms than dads have left the workforce to tend to toddlers or school age children. So that's huge, right? And then on the flip side, we have those moms who have remained in the workforce, but they now are faced with reducing their hours to deal with the additional burden of homeschooling because now schools are closed. And so now there have to be teachers, they have to be caregivers, and they have to be workers. And for some, they have had to make the decision to let their career take a backseat. So one of the things that we did at Mercer, we introduced a parent support group and benefits to really support our parents that had young children at home. And it really included a partnership and tutoring discounts from an education provider to help our parents with their young kids. So, as part of an inclusive recovery, we do need to think about how we can give women who have exited the labor force, I would say, an on ramp back in to ensure that they are not starting over in their careers. Thus reversing some of the progress that we have made over the last few years to close the gender gap. And the last challenge I'll mention quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, is around equity in the healthcare or impaired access to inclusive benefits, right? I think it was mentioned earlier on, the rise in mental health since COVID is tremendous. Some are calling it the fourth wave. And what we've seen is that it has disproportionately impacted women and members of the LGBTQ plus and BIPOC communities. And one of the reasons that was cited by CAMH is childcare and school closures. And I think related to my earlier point, for us at Mercer, and I'm sure other organizations, we are seeing evidence in our own employee population where some of our mothers are really struggling with the burden of homeschooling and domestic responsibilities and work. And if you think about the BIPOC community, there's this additional anxiety on top of the burden of homeschooling, given that a high percentage of that group, are essential or frontline workers and are heavily concentrated in this community. And so members of the community are more likely to know someone who has passed from COVID or who have been hospitalized. And if I think about myself, for example, I know at least 4 persons. My husband knew at least 10 who have passed from COVID. And that's a lot. So there are more psychological trauma being experienced by the community. But according to a recent research that I saw coming out of the Boston Consulting Group and Civic Action Group, Blacks are 4 times less likely to access mental health services than the non-racialized population. So COVID has made it painfully obvious that there is a need to have more inclusive benefits and unimpaired access to health care. And one of the insights we found at Mercer is that when we look at traditional health and well-being benefits, they often fail to take into account racial and ethnic identities, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So offering more services tailored to a diverse population can make a difference. And we're told that in Toronto, the introduction of a culturally adapted cognitive behavioral therapy at one of the women's healthcare center led to a 90% reduction in Black women visiting hospitals, ER hospitals for mental health issues. And I think that that's significant. So lastly, and I'll wrap it up, I think the question we have to ask ourselves as employers, as government is, if the benefits we provide are not inclusive or culturally adapted, and the different needs of our communities are not being captured, then does our workforce really have access to the tools they need to be well? Thanks, Rose.
Thank you, Angelita. It was a very comprehensive, holistic answer. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go to you, Sheila, and then we'll come back and if there's, additional remarks on your statement, I'd like to do that. So Sheila, given your experience, who is making advancements for unrepresented, underrepresented groups in your industry or your community, and what are they doing? It could be from your community or what you've heard. It would be good if you could share that with us.
Sure, thank you very much. And just to get back a bit on my community name, just to give you a little bit of history and context of where I come from and the community that I represent, the name Bunbonabee means a big hole or deep, deep, deep lake. And the legend is that there used to be mermaids in our lake. So we have a lot of deep, deep history in our community and rich culture. And a lot of the little kids still in my community still speak Cree, so that's very hopeful. And this is the community that I'm talking about is isolated, remote, and also classified as some of the most vulnerable areas in Canada for COVID. And they have been hit hard in communities like ours, but also in urban areas, Indigenous people have been impacted quite a bit. And when you say unrepresented or underrepresented, I would say that Indigenous people are represented, but even being represented doesn't guarantee that they're getting the resources that they need to overcome this pandemic, right? And it's been really difficult. So you ask who is making an impact and who is doing something good. I would say that without getting too political, our communities, Indigenous communities led by our chiefs and councils and planners, have done remarkably well compared to other communities in spite of the challenges and in spite of not having access to everything that they need all the time. They acted really fast on what they knew would work for the communities, including shutting down the borders even before the province did, and even before Canada, or just after Canada did for international travel. Our communities took action and started putting borders up and limited mobility because they didn't want people to be hurt or impacted. And for the first and second wave, we saw few numbers of COVID cases in Indigenous communities, but that wasn't going to be forever, and everyone knew that, and everyone was bracing. And so then the second and third wave came, and people started getting vaccinated. But then Indigenous communities and leaders, especially, decided that they didn't want to waste any of the vaccines that they had, because there, of course, there's hesitancy in all communities of getting the vaccine shot, and more so in some Indigenous communities because of the history with the residential schools and what happened there during that time when they were kids. So a lot of elders are hesitant. So the leadership decided to open up some of their extra vaccines to outside community members, including non-Indigenous people, because they care about the people that come to their community, that work with them, but they also wanted to share what they have. And that's the heart and the beauty of our community. We've always been like that. That's what our elders teach us. And so those are the right things that are happening. And we're seeing that Indigenous people can have and do have the capacity to run their own communities. And I think that's where the investments and the changes need to happen going forward, with governments and businesses and industries, to make sure that they respect the sovereignty of nations, to make sure that from now on that they're the ones in the driver's seat to decide on what needs to happen. We talked a lot about some of the challenges, including Max talking about connectivity and sometimes the lack of access of it. You know, we were expecting our kids to still keep going to school. We were still expecting teachers to keep teaching in northern communities and remote, and half the time, and more than half the time, there wasn't any connectivity. So, you know, what do we expect now, that we want kids to be functioning at a normal level when we didn't give them a normal access to education? That's impossible. So we have to adjust and start creating new policies and new relationships to make sure that we are not intentionally and unintentionally letting people keep suffering with the lack of access to things like the modern things that we now rely on. And they're not a luxury anymore. They're actually sometimes life and death for the needs that need to be met, including connectivity for education, but also for business. I see a lot of opportunity now. I think that there was a resurgence, or people more engaged in the land-based training, for example. That's one of the first, in the first and second wave in our communities, our chiefs and councils and leaders in the community started really valuing their need to send their people on the land to go and live off the land. And that, but that also means you have to support with what they need: nets and ammunition and vehicles for families to go out on the land and enjoy it and feed their families, but also have something to do during lockdowns. But I think people see and love the value of having that experience. And now we have an opportunity to share it with the rest of the world, because I think while we were all stuck at home as well, we started to realize the value of our backyards and the value of our own areas, right? And we all want to spend money making sure that everything in our home is conducive to feeling good and relaxing. And I think we kind of forgot that, and before the pandemic, we didn't value and we took for granted the safety of our homes. But we also know that the housing is something that we talked about. We know that's been a huge problem. Um, some people, of course, that didn't come from Indigenous communities or reserves, isolated or not, having access to adhere to restrictions wasn't always a luxury. So isolation, you cannot isolate if you have 17 people in a 3-bedroom home that's falling apart. It's impossible. And so I think those are the lessons, the big lessons that we've learned coming out of it. And in spite of all that, I believe that First Nations led the way in a lot of ways on what we should be doing to make sure that our most vulnerable, including our seniors and our young people and people struggling with other health issues, including mental health and disabilities, are better taken care of. And Indigenous people, again, have proven themselves that they can do it. So government, I believe, are starting to listen more. And we hear it in the discussions around the 215 kids that were discovered in Kamloops. Some of us, as pundits, we call, I guess, we called for Indigenous-led investigations. And now we're hearing governments talk like that as well. And they should have been talking like that all along. Everything that has to do with Indigenous people should be Indigenous-led.
Thank you, Sheila. When I was listening to you, there was a lot of suffering, but there was a lot of hope. And so thank you for sharing, what we don't tend to read on social media. And so thank you for sharing that. So I'll go to Max. What practical advice would you give to someone from an equity seeking group who was starting out?
Well, thank you. So we've been talking about a lot of things that we've learned over the last 2 years with COVID, and myself in particular, listening to all you ladies speak today. Some of my notes I have to change as you guys were speaking because I got to go back to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this a little bit. Prior to COVID, if you met me, I was speaking on this kind of level. I was talking about how close to 60,000 individuals with disabilities right now are seeking work. I would talk about how persons with disabilities were constantly trying to get some attention about being able to function at home. We all knew that technology allowed us to work at home, but we had no proven track record that it would work. The other thing we were always arguing about is allowing some kind of mentorship program that allow people with disabilities to enter into the workplace, create some kind of mentoring that these individuals would learn in the workplace, and at the same time, so with their coworkers. And the last thing we talked about is all the supporting structure elements like transportation and as well as home care services. So when COVID hit, all of that kind of got put in a bag or put in the water with the baby and thrown out as well. So what I mean by this is a lot of positive things have happened. And I'm a positive kind of person. If you get to meet me, you'll notice I'm always talking about how we can move forward on particular angles. What COVID has done instrumentally for persons with disabilities, any individual with disabilities, is shown that we can all be highly functional at home. Now, some would argue, what does that look like? I mean, my joke here in my family is, as I get out of bed and I wheel 20 feet and I'm in my office. So I don't have to deal with transportation back downtown. I don't have to deal with all the fun stuff you need to do to get there. I get to my office within 20 minutes of waking up, and sometimes I have longer days. So that might be a bad consequence of it. But at the same day, I'm functional. The other problem that COVID did cause, or wasn't a little bit negative is that my community suffered some of the biggest issues with we relied on people to come into our households to do some basic functional things, like to clean our houses, just to do some basic stuff. And all of a sudden, now we had to close our doors. And so a lot of individuals with disabilities started having some real structural problems at home, going, how am I going to deal with this? And on top of it, they're thinking about how am I going to function at work? The good news is we all know that that worked out, but it didn't work out on cleaning the house. It didn't work out on a bunch of stuff. But the lights started turning on. And what I mean by that is, again, prior to COVID, if my lovely wife wasn't going to be home for dinner and she wasn't going to be around to help me out because I can't cook, my hands can't lift over a stove, I had two choices. I could order 1-800 chicken, 1-800 pizza. And I don't know about you, but when you got those kind of options, you kind of get sick of ordering out. So I'm really glad that technology has advanced now that I can order anything I want and I can even order my groceries now. Now, if you had asked me about 4 years ago if that was going to be a probable outcome, I would have said no way that that was going to happen. As much as we were all embracing the internet and what it was capable of, we were still having some hypothetical. Are we really going to do that? We're actually going to buy our groceries online? Oh, God forbid. And I remember the last day I went into work. I have two funny scenarios about this. My daughter was driving me into work, and her and I were having a slight argument. And the argument she was having is because she has two young daughters was can they be educated through the internet? Can they, go to school from home? And my argument was yes, it's going to be a very painful process, but eventually, yes, most people will be learning from home. And eventually we will come up with some kind of structure for both kids. And lo and behold, 3 months later, what are the government's talking about is how all of our kids can learn from home. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand the transition is incredibly painful. And I understand that a lot of people, started working from home, all of a sudden had to not only work from home, but had to take care of their kids, had to do with everything on top of it and be stuck at home. Now, the last thing my daughter and I were arguing on the same day is I saw a gentleman in an electric wheelchair, similar to what I have, but who was blind in an electric wheelchair with a cane in front of him, trying to make sure he didn't hit an obstacle. And I realized that technology at this point still has not advanced far enough. So, what I'm trying to get at is anybody entering into today's marketplace, I believe they got a golden opportunity that Jennifer was saying. And if you listen to what Angelita was saying, if you go and do your research and you can find some opportunities to help fund some of your ideas, I think today is a golden opportunity. I love risk. I'm going to be honest with you. When I was talking to Rose about this, I said I'm a risk kind of guy. I love it when the world falls apart because when the world falls apart, people like me like to come in and help rebuild it. And I think right now there's a golden opportunity for every sector, be it from home care services, from hospitalization to education to just strict financing to every aspect of the world right now is on the peak of what did we learn during COVID? And the one thing we learned is we still don't have the right tools. We still have an open foray where people can come up with innovative approaches and move forward. So, what anybody who's listening to me today, what I really suggest you do is take the time of thinking about your ideas and really ask yourself, is now the time to go and do it? And I would say yes. If you want to get into the restaurant area, you can get machine and equipment for pennies on the dollar. If you want to open up a storefront, which I really don't recommend, but if that's the way you want to go, you can get leases on pennies on the dollar right now. And so right now is a great opportunity to go out there and test drive your ideas. Now, as I was going to say in my big speech, one of the great things that's happening in Canada right now are two fundamental big things. I see it as positive. You guys might not. But there are a lot of people right now that were stuck in a job for 2 years and thought, I don't think I really enjoy this job as much as I thought. And so we saw a lot of people, and I would say predominantly most of them were women, left the workplace. And so most of these individuals are now sitting at home thinking, what am I going to do and moving forward? And again, I don't want to get into into this argument about what is better, services or products. But here's one thing I need to say to everybody. I've been working with a graphic artist for now about 5 years. I've never met her. I've only seen her virtually. I've never met her any location at all. However, she cannot use her arms and legs. She uses a stick to do all of her graphic arts, and the stuff is amazing. I hire her every time out. And so, what that means to me is that if you're a lawyer, you're a financial advisor, you're any of these kind of skill sets, you can sell your skills now online. Now, there are some marketing places to do so, and I really highly suggest it for everybody to take a look at this. So, what I'm trying to say in a really blunt way, because all of the ladies who spoke before me kind of addressed all my points, we're also going to see a lot of people right now asking themselves what they're going to do with their money. And what I mean by that is, if you look at, you've been hearing the historians talk about this, every pandemic that has preceded this one, there's always been a rush afterwards. There's a lot of money sitting in the banks, there's a lot of money sitting in the governments. Yes, they still have money, and there's a lot of money that they now need to invest back into the public. And so I believe there's going to be a sugar rush, is what I like to call it. And right now, if you're a person from a minority group, we are listening. The governments are starting to listen to minority groups, as not as much as I want them to, but they're starting to listen. And so we collectively, be it women, visible minorities, indigenous people, and persons with disabilities, we need to continue the pressure on the governments and the corporations to ensure that they're listening, that we should hire more of these individuals from these minority groups, or listen to their ideas and fund their ideas. So there you go. I will give you back some time so you can have a discussion with everybody.
Thanks, Max, and very practical ideas. You answered that question really well. So I'd like to take, we have a couple of questions, so I'd like to take some from the audience to our panelists. And I'll pick one of you to answer. So how about Jennifer? We haven't heard from you for a while. I'll give you the first question. What is something or one thing the business community can act upon to ensure an inclusive recovery?
Well, I think that's a really great question, Rose. And, to respond to, the several challenges raised by Angelita, Max, and Sheila, there's areas where the business community can support other businesses with access to capital, access to networks, mentors, helping them with connections. One of your questions around, who's making advancements for underrepresented or underserved groups, and there certainly are some community organizations who are doing some really great things to try and change systems. And one of them that comes to mind for me is SheEO, who are really trying to create a new way of supporting women and diverse owned business owners to really be successful. They're creating open, inclusive, and safe spaces. They're creating platforms to connect people, and they've created a platform they call the Ask Give platform. And I think that would be my advice is, to those people starting out, or those people that are continuing to persevere down a journey, whether it's professionally or with a business, is to not be afraid to ask for help, ask for someone to mentor you, to be your sponsor, ask for what you need. And then from others of us in the business community, let's give what we can give to support, whether it be women, BIPOC, Indigenous, or people from the LGBTQ communities, or those with varying abilities. I think we all have a responsibility to change how we think and change how we support. So that would be my comment.
That's great. Thank you. The next question, maybe Sheila, you could take this question. What is the best form of allyship in terms of improving inclusion and diversity in a business or a workplace? What can allies do? Because you mentioned, the vaccines were given to, you're outside your community, but what kind of supports could you get from your community or in your industry?
I think the simplest way to look at that being an ally is to be a good neighbor, to be a good friend, to be a good acquaintance, right? And what does that mean? How would you want to be treated in those times of needs that you found yourself in? And so I think that it's as basic as that. But also, for business community, there is a call to action in the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The business industry and governments are being called to do more, and that includes us, because without any of those systems, all those systems need us. And so we have to figure out what we're doing. Are we making room for other people? Are we being good mentors? Are we offering the ability to step aside and let other people have a turn on situations or things or positions? And that's being a good ally, is making sure that you celebrate. And I don't even think of it negatively, but celebrate your privilege by offering it to help other people have a little bit of that. It won't take your privilege away, but it'll help, create spaces for other people. And I think that we've learned a lot of that, and I value that. I value the people that have learned to be a good ally, and some of it is instincts. I think a lot of us forget we have that ability to just share what we have, and sometimes in a crisis we tend to hover and to hold things close to us because we think it's going to get lost, but it's not. I think that's the way it's going to grow, is if we share what we have. And so TRC 92 is a good one to look at to see where you might fit. And specifically, TRC 92 talks about governments and industry to look at their policies to make sure that they're inadvertently or maybe advertently racist. Do they cause barriers to happen for people to be able to access jobs, or even to gain advancement in their workplaces? And also even simple things like holidays. Indigenous people and a lot of other people, different cultures, don't necessarily celebrate Christmas and Easter, but they will take a month off or a week off to do their ceremonies they need to do to heal themselves. So we have to, as businesses, be able to accommodate and look at the policies and how can they be conducive to supporting people that don't necessarily celebrate the same things that we do. So yeah, allyship is key, and mentorships and partnerships. Let's just build all these ships together and make a better world.
That's nice. Thank you. Angelita, so someone noted you made a great point about the loss of informal networking. And so Margaret has been hearing a lot that people want opportunities when we go back to or not after work because of other responsibilities. So do you have any best practices for creating opportunities in working hours?
Good. Just wanted to come off mute. So I think obviously it continues to be a challenge in terms of, trying to network. I think what we need to do is we'll have to really be deliberate and carve out time, I would say, to create those opportunities to network with our individuals. So for example, senior leadership can, I think, set up mentorship programs whereby they're reaching out, identifying and reaching out on a regular basis to individuals to be connected with them, to give them that opportunity to have those informal conversations. I think also that one of the things that can be done is really, when we're thinking about going back to the hybrid model, we're thinking about, should we have a day that we're saying that everyone would come into the office so that we can have those informal conversations that normally would take place in our normal world, where people would be able to connect. So I don't have a 1, 2, 3 answer. I think it's really that we have to be deliberate and make it a priority in terms of we're going to reach out and make it a priority to connect with individuals in our organization because it's important to us. Schedule meetings. For me personally, I've been doing that. I have in my calendar meetings that I'm having just to catch up with those in my organization that are from an underrepresented group like myself too, to just make sure that they're getting that opportunity to have leadership connection. So individuals, I think the leaders will have to make that deliberate decision to do those connections. And again, also in terms of mentorship of the underrepresented group, make that part of the program. Also, I think too, to make sure that is happening as well, is making it part of your metrics so that it is for your leaders are being held accountable to really have those interactions and promote those underrepresented group in your organization.
Thank you, Angelita. So Max, I'll go to you next. One last word before my closing remarks. If anything you've heard today that you'd like to add to, or anything new that you'd like to share with us.
Well, the one thing I want to add on to is based on what Angelina was saying, is that we can't go out there and say to everybody, go out and hire visible minorities and minorities into programs and indigenous people, and then just put them in a job and say, thank you very much. We're glad you're here. Here's everything you go. And then you peter off on your way. The individual will fail 9 times out of 10. um, right now I'm calling it the digital nomad situation where we, there's a whole generation of people who have been hired. I know at BDO we've hired about 5 individuals I've never met, and they work with me, and they don't do what I call the water cooler talk, right? They're not. I can't sit down and go, "How you doing? How's things are going with you? How's the family life?" I can't have these conversations, so I have to take the extra step to do so virtually, and make sure that when I'm talking to them, to make sure that I'm kind of probing a little bit more, like I would if I was in the office. And I think that we need to really incorporate good mentorship onboarding practices to ensure that individuals do succeed. And if you look at any new entrepreneur, like at the end of the day, the backbone of Canada is new businesses. It's individuals who run the stores that are 10 to 15 to 20 people. And so I look at those individuals and say, just because you're small doesn't mean not taking the right amount of time to talk to your staff and making sure they're integrating properly, they're enjoying their work, and you're moving forward from there. So that's my final comments.
Okay, thank you, Max. What a wonderful discussion. We went from, all over the world, the global markets, to, in the workplace, the corporate world, to communities, very near and dear to our heart, and then to an individual level, whether you're abled or, you have some challenges in terms of your abilities. But again, so much hope in overcoming those barriers. So I thank you all for making this a very enjoyable afternoon.